In this video, we examine the archaeological complex of Pisac. Using archival photographs, it is possible to trace its transformation into its present-day appearance. This allows both researchers and ordinary visitors to distinguish between modern and ancient stonework. It should be noted from the outset that there are no publicly available reports documenting the course of the restoration work carried out during that period. The photographs themselves do not even contain captions indicating specific stages of the work. Although they were taken by Luis Valcárcel, director of the National Museum of Archaeology, Anthropology and History of Peru, the only firmly established fact is that the restoration was carried out in the late 1950s and early 1960s by the architect Oscar Ladrón de Guevara Avilés, who was also responsible for the restoration of Coricancha after the 1950 earthquake. Even if a report similar to that produced for Coricancha had existed, it would be reasonable to expect that it would have contained only references to elements that existed prior to the restoration, and those added later. Here, however, a comparison of photographs from different years proves sufficient and has been carried out in a separate video. In the present analysis, we will attempt to reconstruct the sequence of the restoration works and to identify the differences between ancient and modern stonework. Restoration reports do not contain what is most important, the aspects highlighted in the work of Trinidad Aguilar Mesa, namely, who actually carried out the stonework, what level of experience that person had, and what kind of technical outlook they possessed, what tools were used, how much time the work required, and to what extent the result matched or differed from the ancient workmanship. With certain reservations regarding the tools and methods employed, restoration is in many respects close to experimental archaeology, particularly when specific structural elements need to be reconstructed. This information has been irretrievably lost. To be fair, a restoration report is not obliged to include such data. We will now attempt to extract the information that is still available. We begin by examining what this place looked like a century ago. There exists not only a large number of photographs, but also video footage that allows us to trace the condition of the buildings prior to reconstruction. The first point to note is that the destruction was most likely caused not by natural disasters, but by deliberate dismantling of structures in search of treasure, acts of vandalism, or the reuse of stone as construction material. Since the number of scattered blocks does not correspond to the quantity required for a full reconstruction of the buildings, it can be concluded that the complex was used as a quarry, much like what happened at Sacsayhuaman. And although transporting blocks through mountainous terrain does not appear to be a simple task, the photographs show that it was entirely feasible. The reuse of blocks from polygonal structures in Cusco can be clearly traced. However, identifying buildings in Pisac itself, or in the nearby town, where blocks removed from the archaeological monument may have been reused, is not possible, since the walls there are predominantly plastered. It should also be noted that the polygonal buildings of Pisac are not large in scale, and that their construction required on the order of 100 blocks per course. This is a general characteristic of polygonal architecture, where monumentality and visual impact are achieved through the use of megaliths and high-quality joints, while the total number of blocks remains limited. In the case of Pisac, several thousand blocks are estimated to be missing, an amount sufficient to build at most a single two-story building. Thus, the damage inflicted is disproportionate to any practical benefit gained. Fortunately, the foundations survived, and some buildings were preserved to more than half of their original height, including the arrangement of niches. This is especially important, since aside from niches, no other atypical architectural elements are observed in polygonal constructions. This later made it possible to partially reconstruct the complex not on the basis of speculation, but on genuinely existing and authentic foundations. Only a few buildings have survived particularly well. Of the others, only masonry courses up to the level of the niches remain. Some of the heavily damaged structures have remained in almost the same condition to this day. It can be observed that during the restoration process, predominantly authentic blocks were used. Apparently, the transport and production of new blocks from suitable stone was not actively practiced at Pisac. It should also be noted that the exact location of the quarry from which the material was extracted is unknown. There are hypotheses based on petrographic similarity with nearby rock outcrops. The stone itself is identified as andesite, while the dark-colored bedrock is described as volcanic breccia. The quantity and quality of the available photographs make it possible to trace how the blocks were initially scattered chaotically, then organized, and subsequently only those structures for which sufficient material was available were restored. Additionally, it should be noted that there are no traces of rubble masonry that could have formed gables. If such elements had existed, as for example at Machu Picchu, the entire area would have been covered with their remains following collapse or dismantling. One could, of course, argue that the complex was never completed and that the gables were simply left unfinished. In support of this view, one might point to the absence of masonry around the Intihuatana, even though the bedrock had already been shaped to receive blocks. However, the typical recesses associated with precise block fitting are not visible, which may indicate that certain elements of this complex were also left incomplete. In other words, this may be regarded as evidence of unfinished work. Could it also be the case that the roofs were never installed? This appears unlikely, since directly at the center of the complex there is a building constructed of rough stone laid in clay mortar. If sufficient time was available to construct this building, there would have been sufficient time to erect gables as well, not to mention that numerous similar buildings exist nearby. At the same time, some of these buildings also lack gables, as in certain cases the roof was hipped, supported by a fully wooden framework. It is therefore possible that this type of roof was employed at Pisac, and that over the centuries no traces of these roofs have survived. This interpretation, however, has its limitations. No roof attachments are visible, such as protruding stone elements intended to support roofing structures. It should also be taken into account that buildings of particular significance, which undoubtedly include structures built of carefully fitted stone, were traditionally provided with gables. Therefore, the question of the existence of roofs remains open. The fact that the rough stone building did not undergo significant destruction further indicates that the polygonal structures were deliberately dismantled. A natural disaster could not have destroyed robust polygonal masonry while leaving a structure of a simpler type intact. The question of cylindrical bosses between the niches also remains open. Archival photographs show chips that are clearly visible even today, and are presumably associated with the former presence of cylindrical protrusions in these locations. However, among the scattered blocks, not a single example with such elements can be identified. This suggests that the protrusions may have been produced during the restoration process, based on considerations of symmetry, since the tendency of polygonal buildings towards symmetrical arrangement of elements can reasonably be regarded as a rule. In this context, one of the key questions is how authentic masonry differs from modern masonry, and whether they differ at all. For example, at the foundations of Coricancha, these differences are easy to identify even without knowing which fragments are original and which were subjected to modern reconstruction. This can be determined by examining tool marks. Ancient stoneworking is characterized by a rough, irregular surface that gradually becomes smoother toward the joint. There is no periodicity in the tool marks. The depressions do not form groups or repeating patterns. By contrast, modern bush hammer finishing produces a characteristic pattern, and the surface appears smoother, with regular indentations from the teeth. Near the joints, traces of chisel use are visible. In the case of Pisac, such a clear distinction is not observed. One reason is that pre-existing blocks were used rather than newly produced ones, meaning that some of their surfaces may be entirely or partially original. For example, when a block was reworked only near the joint due to its new position, the rest of the surface could remain unchanged. It should also be taken into account that some blocks may have been reinstalled in their original positions, or with minimal modification. Since masonry courses vary in height, it is not difficult to match blocks lying near a wall to the appropriate course. The same applies to lintels, which have characteristic dimensions that distinguish them from other blocks. Despite all of the above, surfaces worked with modern hand tools do differ from ancient ones by the same criteria observed at Coricancha, though less conspicuously. This may be due to different properties of the stone, such as its structure, strength, and color, as well as to the conditions and quality of the photographic documentation. Nevertheless, in some photographs the difference between surfaces is clearly visible, and traces of bush hammering can be identified as clusters of uniform depressions. In some cases, chisel marks near the joints can also be observed. Additionally, it can be noted that step transitions in the height of masonry courses are virtually absent in authentic construction. Most likely, this is because during the original construction the course height was adjusted after the blocks were set in place. During restoration, this was more difficult to achieve, since the block dimensions were already fixed and work was carried out with minimal reshaping, which led to height discontinuities. Restored sections also display a large number of chipped edges, which are entirely absent in the ancient areas. The cause of these chips may lie not in the carelessness of the restorers, but rather in damage sustained by the blocks during dismantling. The hydraulic system also underwent substantial reconstruction. The shape of the channels was altered, and what we see today represents a concept that is close to, but not authentic to, the original. Some atypical solutions can also be observed. For example, the rear wall of certain niches is made using inserted blocks, an approach for which only isolated examples exist throughout Peru. It should be taken into account that this building underwent major reconstruction. Archival photographs show that the corner was originally lower, while its present height has been significantly increased. It is precisely in this building that numerous traces of bush hammering can be observed on the blocks, and the joints are not flawless. There are frequent step transitions in the height of the masonry courses and many small inserted blocks, which are atypical for the rest of the complex. All of this indicates later modifications. In addition, the blocks forming the side walls of the niches, where inserts are present, do not lie on a single level, and the entire rear wall is the result of restoration. The use of smaller blocks than in all other buildings also draws attention. In most structures, the height of the niches is achieved with only 2 masonry courses, whereas here, 3 courses were required. At the same time, a block of complex shape lies in plain view, bearing a characteristic trace of a previous joint. It is also clearly visible that the authentic lower part of the masonry consists of relatively small blocks, comparable in size to those used during the restoration. The presence of blocks of complex shape and blocks of smaller dimensions may indicate that this building was originally assembled from residual construction material. Such an approach can often be observed in the upper sections of walls, where blocks of different sizes were used for the final courses, while the quality of the joints nevertheless remained at the same high level. Therefore, the use of inserted blocks as the rear walls of the niches may have been a necessary measure due to a shortage of building material, and may have been part of the original construction. This in turn raises further questions. For example, what kind of shortage of building material could be meant in a mountainous environment? What prevented the builders from spending additional time to quarry blocks of typical dimensions? Why resort to a solution in which several blocks had to be fitted instead of a single one? Such solutions are, in general, characteristic of polygonal constructions and require separate study. To summarize, despite the differences noted above, the restorers achieved an excellent level of workmanship, one that is practically indistinguishable from the original. During the restoration, original blocks were used, and in most cases the locations of the niches are authentic, as they remain intact either entirely or in part. Some decisions raise questions, but they were made in accordance with the architectural canons of polygonal construction. Of course, it would be convenient if the restored sections and the authentic ones were clearly separated. On the other hand, with a careful and attentive approach, such a division is not strictly necessary. Thank you for watching. See you next time.